Okay, I think it started recording. So, welcome everyone to our first workshop for our MSWI case competition. If you're not making it to the Zoom, hi online. Thanks so much for listening. We definitely recommend listening to the whole thing, and then you could ask us questions by email. And if you're here on Zoom, you can ask us in the chat or just take off your mic, whatever you want. So this task, if you haven't got started already, it's journal entries. We wanted to have a fun take on communicating science. So this way you can pretend that you're a science discoverer, an author of a paper from the past, present, or future, really. Take it however way you want. And so Taylor here, a member of MSWI and master's student, is going to take us through some tips on how to do this task. So thanks so much, Taylor.
Thanks so much. I'm so excited to be hosting the first workshop of this season. Um, Welcome. I just wanted to give a little bit of a briefing over what the case competition is for anybody coming in that's new, a little bit of the background that I know, and then we could jump into some tricks and tips and ideas and brainstorming for how we can jump into this first um, task. Whoops, sorry about that. Here we go. Okay, so a little bit about me to start. I'm Taylor. Sydney Wasserman, who's in this chat right now, we're identical twin sisters. That's exactly how I got involved here through her. When I was in my undergrad, I actually jumped into the case competition just like you all. I formed a group with a bunch of friends from all different backgrounds and disciplines and faculties. And we got together and had a really fun time choosing a topic that we were all a little bit interested in different ways and brought it together into something really cool. So I go by she, her pronouns, and I'm currently an architectural candidate. I am in my master's, finishing up my final semester at McGill. I did my undergrad and my master's at McGill University in architecture, and I'm very interested and passionate about graphic design and communication in general. I've done a lot of different types of communication, whether it's visual or at conferences in kind of teaching formats. I love everything about it. So this is why I think it'd be exciting for me to share my perspective in this way. So I wanted to start with a general understanding of what the SCICOMM case competition is. I think you all got a little bit of a briefing already with all of the instruction manuals and all of the content that exists online. They have an incredible informative website, a bunch of resources that you could jump into and look further into whenever you'd like. But basically, MSWI, McGill Scientific Writing Initiative, from my understanding, is a cool opportunity to make science communication and creative writing or writing in general accessible to everyone, and really just to help especially the McGill community um, learn about in a very digestible way how to communicate their topics and their own research in science or even outside of that in an engaging way to a variety of audiences. So that's where the case competition, sorry, comes in, where they've organized, I think this is the fifth annual SciComm case competition, yearly case competition, where they organize this whole event, as I had mentioned, where you jump into teams, which you've already all done, choose a topic based on an overall theme, and then you get to practice through three different tasks, creatively figuring out different ways to communicate your topic and your interest and your research to a variety of different audiences. So that's the really cool part here. Sometimes you think that it's going to be the easiest task ever to communicate it to a very general or a young audience. And then this is a really cool way to understand the complexities that come behind, communicating a really hard or difficult topic to a very general or young audience. This is a really good practice for that. And I think very useful for everyone's daily life. So the theme this year, you all know, is connections, which is awesome. I think it's vague enough to allow us to really have creativity within this. I do believe you must have chosen the topics within this theme yesterday, I think was the deadline. But if anyone is still up for, trying to figure out what fits best and has not submitted, I'm sure after this we could start to brainstorm and think of cool ways to find a topic that's applicable to all the tasks and really allows you to play around with that. In the past, I remember the themes included evolution, and there was a sustainability or the environment as a theme, just to kind of have an idea of, how that broader theme can really have so many different types of topics within it. And yet they're really different from year to year. So I think it's a great job. The tasks within it we'll go over today. So task one, as you all might know, it's just started and it'll be a 2 week long period where you'll have to create 3 different letters for a time capsule. We'll jump into all of the details for that, mainly in this workshop. So that'll really be able to give you all a better grasp on what the next upcoming task is. But just to kind of foresee, again, if you haven't chosen that topic, it's a really good idea to kind of look at all the tasks to understand how you're going to adapt your topic in different ways. So the first one is letters. You'd basically think of what audience would read a time capsule letter from the past, present, future. It's a little bit of a creative twist here, but generally, I would think that an audience for that would not necessarily be a scientist or somebody super informed about this topic. It would be a bit more of a general audience. So it's an interesting perspective to think about. Then task two would be an elevator pitch. I don't know if anybody's heard about what an elevator pitch is before, but generally, I think of physically where that kind of term came from is physically being in an elevator. Think about the amount of time you are in an elevator for, like probably 1 minute tops, 1.5 minute tops. And the idea here is to try and pitch your idea, to kind of communicate your whole idea in such a short period of time to really get the interest there and the understanding there as much as possible. So the fewest amount of words, really, you don't want to be rushing through your speech within a minute in an elevator to try and convince somebody to take on your project or whatever it is. You really want to make sure that it punches and that they, of course, can learn more after, but just that you get them hooked and informed enough to be interested. So I think that's a really good practice for us all, whether or not we're pitching a business idea in an elevator anytime soon. I think it's just good practice. And then finally, once those 2 tasks are finished by March 3rd, there's going to be some sort of judgment that happens to let us know who has made it past this phase and into the literature review phase. So by March 11th, those chosen and able to move on to that next phase will be able to physically write an entire literature review, well-rounded, best practice. It's really, really good exercise. And within the finalists, there's actually a prize to get that published. And there's monetary prizes and amazing, exciting prizes involved. So definitely worth your while if you get to that point to put in all your effort there, because it could be a great opportunity for so many people interested in writing and science and all of that. And then finally, after the literature reviews are all submitted, we'll have that big symposium. If anybody's heard of this big symposium at the end of the year, it happens in April, and it'll be an awesome time where everyone gets to showcase their work. The finalists get all announced, the prizes get given out. It's such a good time. And I participated during COVID time, and even that was fun, that Zoom symposium, but I'm sure this year is going to be even more fun. So I think it's definitely a lot to look forward to. So for today's workshop, I just wanted to really dive in further into this first task so that by the end of this Zoom meeting, that we all have a really good understanding of what to move on to next, considering we're like within that first task right now. And then we can look at different techniques for creative scientific writing. I don't know if I have the most insightful things to say. I know that some tips and tricks that I've learned have worked for me in the past. And so I'm happy to share those and please build on that and use this just as a tool for your resources. And then at the very end, I'm going to give a little bit of an example if I were to be in your position, what topic I might choose, a little bit of a brainstorming sesh. If anybody at that point wants to turn on their mic or anything and include, we could brainstorm about your topics and ideas too. So task one, as I said, it's a time capsule. So I don't know if anybody is not aware of what a time capsule is, but basically it's a way, from my understanding, where people can lock up, like they can kind of collect different elements from their space and time to then keep often like buried underground or locked up, locked away for years to then only be open years later and uncovering kind of the identity and the facts of the time and the context of the time to be able to open it up years later and see what that era used to be like a little bit. Like time capsules exist a lot within schools, like high schools. Well, sometimes a graduating class will put all of their thoughts, their signed jerseys and little love notes and things like that. And then years later, like dozens of years later, you'll open it up, and it's a really cool way to be able to see a little bit of an insight from the past. So we could really take this in our own ways. It's a creative exercise here. So you could choose how far apart you'd like your time capsule openings to be. I think those guidelines aren't necessarily strict, but the idea is to write 3 separate journal entries that represent one from the past, the present, and the future. The idea is to use your topic under the theme of connections to connect, ironically, to connect the past, present, and the future. There should be some sort of like connection and same question or same prompt within the 3 in some way. I would recommend to make them link. And overall, the point of this, the goal would be to understand the evolution of this topic. I think through examples, this will become a lot more clear, but a lot of the things that I would highlight here is to make sure to just include key pieces of knowledge from each era. As we know, as anybody researching different science topics, there's a lot of discoveries that have been made that have iconically defined the topics throughout time. So I feel like that's a really cool ability for us to use in this exercise. We can iconically pull out key dates, key people, key individuals, or key discoveries from each era or from the past mainly to kind of bring in what you would want to communicate. So the idea is for somebody opening these time capsule letters to be able to better understand the evolution of this topic. The basic breakdown here, as I kind of mentioned, is a little overlap, is for the past to kind of historically understand the context around what was happening at the time and how this topic was discovered, why it was even looked in the first place. Was it prompted by an epidemic at the time, a war? Was it prompted by a specific individual? How that kind of historic understanding shapes the topic. And then for the present one, I think a lot of us can use whatever connection we personally have to the topic right now, because you would likely be choosing a topic that you have some sort of connection or interest to. A lot of the tips I'll get into later have that physical, personal, emotional attachment. Since it's like a handwritten journal, I think that's a really good opportunity for the present journal entry to use that kind of personal connection. But it should also reflect current research, technologies, a basic understanding of how the topic is kind of looked at today. And then in the future, the idea is to have almost like projected trajectory for that. So any type of advancement in the topic or the research, potential impacts, new connections that can be made. I think here it's important to look at existing trends and to try and ground your predictions in in the research. So it would be really the best, I would say. It could be creative, like we said, that's like the best part to have like a creative, interesting twist, especially for the future. But I think it would be important to connect it and ground it in facts and things that already exist and kind of align with the trends that have happened over the years. So, in terms of how to kind of go about creating this type of writing to make it the best it possibly could be, I have a few like things to consider. First off, I would say like the first most important thing right after or even before you're starting to do like dive into all of the research to know more yourself about the topic and to understand what points you're going to want to be bringing up throughout like the history and all of them. I think it's important to define as a narrator, as whoever is writing this journal, who your voice is. So, ideally, within the prompt as a journal entry for a time capsule, I would recommend a first person point of view, a perspective that says, I, me, my personal experience, my journey, my emotions. I feel like that would come across the best as opposed to talking about somebody else in the third person. Of course, as a first person perspective, you can be talking about the discoveries that happened with my uncle, my sibling, this famous person. You don't have to be talking about yourself as the discoverer necessarily, but just to bring it back to the first person perspective, I think would be important. On that who you are kind of question, I think it's important to choose a voice, whether that be a fictional character, whether it's a historical figure, or like I said, somebody who did create that invention or was the scientist involved, or maybe the sibling of the scientist, something funky like that. Or even perhaps a non human perspective. Like we can really go creative here. You can be physically the thing that was created potentially. It really depends on the context there. But also, you can, as Ellie was describing before, and I think was prompted in the initial instruction sheet, you could also be a time traveler. So you could be yourself, or you could be this fictional character, a character that traveled from each era, which then would have a twist in the writing that kind of exposed a little bit of that clear idea of what you find as somebody foreign in this era would see as new and interesting. Do you know what I mean? So I would definitely try and make sure that you put yourself in that narration voice and character to understand how you would communicate the different topics as and like I said, to emotionally tie yourself to it. So if that character would be shocked by the news, I would write it in that way. Or if it's something that they've been working on their entire life, definitely make that clear. I think that's going to be like the first big idea when it comes to how to approach this type of exercise. The next thing I would be clear about, which is something that I brought up when we talked about the variety of different tasks, is to think about your audience. Who are you writing to? Of course, this definitely aligns in the same kind of creative grain where you could be communicating to whoever finds this time capsule, and you could say to whoever it concerns, please send this to your closest scientist. And then you might be able to include some jargon in there, a little bit more, some more scientific facts. But I would be clear as to who this is intending to be read by. And if you're not going to be sending it to one individual or one audience specifically, assume the general audience. It's always a good practice. And I think for that, I would just definitely try and avoid the heavy jargon. If you're going to be including a concept, which a lot of the time for these scientific topics, it's necessary and it's interesting to be defining something, especially if it was invented in the era that you're trying to be communicating, you want to mention it, right? But then in order to mention a hard topic, you must describe it in a jargonless way if possible. So definitely keep that in mind when you're writing. And then I would recommend using descriptive language to describe the scene, the context, the item, the thing you're talking about. And I love using metaphors and analogies, connecting it to daily routines that people, like the audience, might connect with. more so than the experience of whatever you're talking about. They might not know what's going on there scientifically, but they could connect that to something that a more general audience would all have experience with, like connecting it to daily routines and things like that. Off that, just other kind of things to think about would definitely be, as I mentioned, context, setting the scene. You can use descriptions for that. You can engage the senses. The whole idea with this creative exercise, too, is to kind of make it feel like somebody's just writing in a journal entry, like a diary entry almost. Like they're trying to just explain where they're at and of course, define the goal of what you're trying to communicate here. But because it's such a short text, it's just 200, 250 words per era, per letter. I would definitely try and keep the discoveries, the communication part, what you're trying to kind of make sure the other person knows as minimal as possible. You don't have to include everything that you know. We know you've done more research than what's in here, and that's the beauty of these types of exercises where you have to kind of bring it down. And in the lit review, once you get there, you will be able to tell us everything and kind of have every piece of research that you find relevant written down. But for this, I would just kind of try and take one key piece or a few key pieces of information that is the most relevant and ties the best to all the different past, present, future eras, and just stick with that. So as I said, set the scene, use those descriptive features, the context, laying out the ground, to allow for that one key piece of information, sorry, to be best communicated. You know, it doesn't have to be so packed. The next thing is just another tip to kind of make it relatable. I said this before, but relating complex ideas to everyday experiences and to connect emotions to things is always a helpful tip, especially in such a creative exercise like this. And then the last thing I would say here is just to build curiosity and narrative tension. This is how to make it over the edge. This is how to get your journal entry to be the top contender, just because you want the people reading this to really feel immersed in the exercise, like they are discovering this new piece of information from the past or from the future, and understanding with starting from a hook. Maybe you're just running away from somebody who's about to kill you, or there's a conflict or a challenge that you overcame, and you kind of communicate that through the writing. I think that's like a really creative, fun way to kind of take a twist on this exercise. And especially when it comes to, the end of a journal entry. I mean, at the end of 200, 250 words, some might end in the middle of a sentence. Some might not have been able to finish their thought. All little tips and tricks and ideas to maybe get some sort of like very interesting creative twist on an exercise like this. Of course, that does not mean that you don't include the right information. You still want it to be well-rounded, but I don't know if anybody's ever read a book that ends in the middle of a sentence. There is definitely some intrigue to that. I would also recommend to keep a consistent tone. So as we mentioned, the first person point of view, that would be best recommended. I would just make sure to keep that consistent throughout. Also, when you're looking at tenses, when you're talking about the future, present, or past, I think all the journal entries would be present tense. So try and make sure to go back over it once you're finished to make sure that that tone really sounds consistent. Really try and keep the tone informal, I would say, but also accurate, insightful, creative. You can use date stamps for the context to really kind of keep it yourself like in line with an understanding. Make sure the audience understands where you're at. Hints to kind of allow them to follow if you're kind of telling a story. And we said emotional reflection. So if you're going to be the same characters we said from all three journal entries, make sure that's obvious in maybe the way you communicate. That can be clear based on the language you use, or maybe an expression that you use, or the introduction, things like that. And the last point here was just, as I mentioned before as well, the future letter, we're just recommending to make sure that it's imaginable but plausible. So I had mentioned to think about real trends and scientific predictions that exist in the literature and in the research to ground your ideas, and to think about the emerging technologies that might evolve. So I think a huge thing here, which is included in actually my example at the end, my brainstorming session, um, I really dove into AI because who knows about robots taking over at this point. So that's a really fun twist that you could definitely take into multiple different topics, considering the emerging technologies and all that is to come. Next. So this is my brainstorming session, as I had mentioned. I don't know what everyone has chosen for their topics, and I'm so open for anybody to kind of share their ideas. I could start with mine just as a little bit of what I had thought of as I was putting this together, but then I would be happy and open to look at some of your ideas and we could brainstorm together if anyone is interested in that. So, in the theme of connections, my mind directly went to relationships, connections to people, from people to people, which is definitely not necessarily the only choice here, but that's where my mind went to automatically. And I thought, let's explore that. So, I was thinking about how people understood relationships and the science behind relationships, the why for relationships over time. So, to start in the past entry, I was thinking we can kind of maybe create a letter that related to Darwin, the key figures of the time, the philosophies of the time, and to kind of keep that mindset consistent with how the understanding of relationships and love and attachment was directly connected to survival. So maybe to keep the tone very consistent as someone who embodies that understanding the best. I would probably create a journal entry describing my own relationship with somebody and my understanding as to why it is best for survival, and maybe not understanding why anybody would be with anybody outside of this reason. Why does my friend not like this other person, considering that's what they need for survival? So that's a little bit of a hint of a connection to how it might change in the future, because obviously we know that relationships in the future are not necessarily based on best case scenario for survival, but much more into the other facets of connections. So I thought that was like a fun twist to do for the past. The current, of course, you could connect them, I think, a little bit better between them. But I thought something interesting and fun and creative for the current entry based on relationships would be related to, again, the current technologies of dating apps and discovering the science behind relationships as being controlled by an algorithm, and understanding that, maybe again, hinting to the future one, hinting to the next letter, that maybe technology is going to take over, which honestly is a conversations I've been through in our current state, where we talk about, yeah, of course we have agency now and we can choose who we date. And dating apps is just a part of that and an experience, and you still go out and choose yourself. But who knows with how the algorithms work, at some point we might not have as much agency as we think. Which brings me to the next one in the future entry, where talk about algorithms taking over. At this point, we're just dating robots and AI is replacing human connection. I mean, talk about creative, like wacky ideas that are somehow rooted in reality. Scary, but I think it's not so far-fetched to kind of have a creative twist like that doesn't bring it so out of context, but it's still a little fictional. So these are just ideas that I was brainstorming. Of course, there's still the aspects of how you communicate that, the tone that you have, and all of that. But as I mentioned, I think the idea is to find that connection, find the goal, who you're trying to communicate, who you are going to be, and then just writing drafts and playing around with how that tone pans out. I think that's the end of my slideshow. If anybody wants to come in, do you want to share any ideas of topics that you have? I'm happy to brainstorm if anybody would like to. And that's okay if not. Do we have any hands?
Thank you so much for sharing that. I think that was really helpful, and we had a few more people trickle in throughout the presentation, so feel free to review the recording if you missed anything. Now is really a great opportunity. We will, I think at this stage, stop the recording just to make it also inviting for people to share their thoughts. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Stop recording.